Now, let's give it up for today's fighters in the red corner, weighing in at 4,700 population in an underdog Rust Belt town from Ohio. It's East Palestine. And in the blue corner, weighing in at 1 million pounds of vinyl chloride, fighting and dropping cars consistently on the ground on Horseshoe Curve, it's Norfolk Southern. And to officiate today's match, from the Department of Transportation, it's Pete Buttigieg.
In an egregious violation of...
Hooking up the country, helping business run. Helping this big...
Jokes aside, this disaster does suck for those who are affected, both with being relocated, with possible contamination, and with the water supply. But everyone has been extremely lucky that there haven't been any deaths or major injuries from this accident. There's one thing that's certain about this incident is that there has been a stupid amount of news coverage, and anyone who says it's a cover-up is a bit goofy at this point. The reason why it wasn't big news in the first place was because derailments usually do not warrant a lot of news coverage. They happen more than most people think, and they're usually pretty mundane and boring for the average 24-hour cable news viewer. I just think that they weren't expecting this one to really blow up as much as it did, so coverage was slow at first. Since it did make it into the major news cycle, there's a lot of interesting and bad coverage from journalists that never talk about trains that suddenly now have to talk about trains. And for people like me who talk about trains a lot, it's been a painful process to read through these articles and takes about what happened. So for clarification, let's take a quick breakdown of what happened with this derailment in basically chronological order. On February 2nd, Norfolk Southern Train 32N left the Terminal Railroads Association's Madison Yard just outside of St. Louis. Allegedly, the train crew that departed from the yard with 32N reported hearing unusual noises from a part of the train that would later have issues. The train then made its way through Illinois, Indiana, and finally into Ohio, being on the move for roughly 700 miles. At 8 p.m. on February 3rd, the train was making its way through Salem, Ohio, 20 miles west of East Palestine, Ohio. Here, flames were spotted coming from one of the axles of one of the cars.
And the video on your screen now shows that the train appeared to be on fire. This is interesting. 20 miles before it reached the site where it actually went off the tracks, derailed. Now, the footage on your screen is captured by a security camera at an equipment plant in Salem, Ohio.
At 8:54 p.m., the failing axle finally gave out and caused the train to derail in East Palestine. From this point, there's a lot of politics, mismanagement, and generally bad communication on all fronts, but I'm not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about the train. So was there any way to prevent this? Yes, actually. One of the tools that U.S. railroads use to make engineers aware that something is wrong with their trains are devices called defect detectors.
Detectors, you have all sorts of types of detectors. You got dragging equipment detectors, detectors for hot bearings. You have line side detectors that do non-safety stuff like telling where the car is. But the most common ones are hot boxes, detectors, and dragging equipment detectors. And lines like this Norfolk Southern line, they're about every 20, 30 miles, depends how many curves. The more intense the layout of the track is, the more hot box detectors you're going to have.
That's my friend Brian. They go by they, them, and they used to work for a Class 1 railroad in field management for maintenance away. I'll be referring to them and two other friends throughout the rest of this video for when I need someone with a little extra experience or knowledge in these subjects to be referenced to. Anyway, defect detectors are a critical piece of infrastructure for any modern railroad. Like Brian said, these detectors can pick up on hot boxes or whenever an axle or bearing is getting too hot. Hot boxes aren't just for that Corolla sitting in a dorm parking lot. The name originally comes from railroads from when old journal bearings were still in use. Journals used to overheat commonly, and the box where the journals sat in oil would catch on fire or smoke. Eventually, journals were replaced with roller bearings, which were not only more efficient but also more reliable. Roller bearings rarely fail or catch on fire nowadays, but it still will happen if they are not maintained or inspected. It's very confusing how the axle on this Norfolk Southern train got to the point of failure. Defect detectors are scattered all throughout the network. Remember that video of the train car on fire going through Salem, Ohio? Well, there's actually a defect detector in Salem. So the alarms should have been going off on the radio calling out to the engineers that there's an issue. I don't know why or understand why 32N didn't stop, because it's proper practice to come to a stop when a detector is tripped. But okay, so if the detectors couldn't have been relied on in this situation, could the brakes have stopped the train from derailing? And what if we upgraded them to a newer system? So if we're going to talk about brakes, I first have to teach you all how train air brakes even work. Modern air brakes on trains work with a pretty simple concept. Compressed air lines on the train are one single system, so when the pressure drops at the locomotive, the pressure will drop throughout the train, causing the brakes to be applied. When there's a drop in air pressure below the normal, the brakes will start to apply. The signal that applies the brakes is literally the drop in air pressure going from car to car. The signal travels as fast as the speed of sound as the pressure drops from car to car. So even if it isn't instantaneous, it only takes a dozen seconds for all brakes to be applied on a 2-mile-long train. Now, what if we wanted to speed up this brake application? In the news, we've been hearing a lot about electro-pneumatic controlled brakes, or ECP brakes. ECP brakes would essentially equip every single car with a computer that would open and close the brakes based on a signal from the engineer. This would allow for the brakes to be applied instantaneously. There are a lot of issues with applying ECP brakes to every car in the country, but I'll talk about that later. One of the current solutions for speeding up brake applications on trains is to place another locomotive somewhere in the train consist or at the rear. This remote-controlled locomotive controls air pressure the same way that the lead locomotive does, essentially doubling the speed of the brake application by being another air control point in the train. Multiple people either working in the industry or part of regulatory agencies all agree that the Norfolk Southern train would have still caused a major incident regardless of whether it had normal brakes or ECP brakes. Here's Jennifer Homendy, an NTSB chair member, responding to questions about brakes and the derailment. Her main point is that if the suggested rules for ECP were even in effect, this train wouldn't even have been affected by the mandate for this consist. Even then, once you derail a car, no matter the braking system you have, you're going to have an issue. So here's my friend Alex, a 5-year engineer on a Western Class 1 railroad, and his opinions on the subject.
And what happened with the Palestine derailment when they say the train went into emergency, I can't say this without having been there myself, of course, but from what I've seen of the bearing on fire and just the accident, I'm betting that the bearing melted off the axle point, the car went on the ground, and as soon as that hose breaks off from the rest of it, it will put the whole train into emergency. Where it broke, we'll send it both directions for emergency braking. However long that may have taken, I can't remember how much or how long 32 Nacho was, but I believe it was somewhere around 800 feet, according to a friend who had it. So that would have taken maybe 3 to 4 seconds going each way to reaching another train. Not long. ECP wouldn't have done anything within that given time frame to do it, especially if the car is on fire.
So if brakes aren't the thing to go after, then what should we be advocating for so something like this doesn't happen again? But before we go on to policy, let's close out this section with some words from my friend Justin Rosniak.
I sort of feel like we're going through this rigmarole again, where it's like, well, we could do basic maintenance and slight upgrades to existing systems, but instead, we're going to go way ahead and say, use this new thing that no one's ever used before.
So I don't want to make this section too long because policy is always a bit difficult to listen to. But Sometimes when people are talking about Pete Buttigieg online and how he can't really do much, they're sort of right. You see, under the DOT, there is an agency called the Federal Railroad Administration, and unlike the airplane version, which is the Federal Aviation Administration, the FRA is very underfunded and doesn't have as much power over the industry that it oversees as the FAA does over its industry. There are two reasons for this, and one is easier to fix than the other. The first is that the FAA controls a lot of publicly owned airports and can easily deny companies the right to use those airports, where the FRA has to deal with private companies and private infrastructure mainly, and so it's harder to oversee all of that. What we should take away from this is that the FRA has a lot less oversight over the industry because it's private. And then the other thing the FRA can do is we can just give it more money, because part of the problem with the FRA is that they don't have enough money to hire enough inspectors to actually go out and check all of our infrastructure regularly, and all the cars and rolling stock and all that too, of course. Next thing to fix is labor. The first thing you should do is you should make it a law that you should have two-man crews. Two-man crews is not only safe, but has subverted some disasters that were going to be worse than the Norfolk Southern derailment. The BNSF Castleton derailment was going to be insanely worse if it wasn't for two-man crews. Part of the train was broken apart after it caught on fire after derailing and taken away from the rest of the train so that the other ethanol cars would not catch on fire. There are other obvious labor policies that you can enact, like forcing the railroads to actually hire enough people to do inspections and keep good schedules instead of forcing people to work way overtime or way too many days in a row. Other than labor, another piece of legislation that's probably needed is a standardization of defect detectors. Defect detectors do not have standards, and they are actually different for each railroad. They just happen to be similar because companies make them similar when they buy them. And lastly is PSR, or Precision Scheduled Railroading. The problem with PSR is that it makes trains double or triple the length that they used to be, and this compounds a lot of problems that already exist, including the fact that if you have a problematic car, it's hard to dig out of the train if there's an issue with it in the first place. So, if you want some rules and policies to fix the industry, here they are. Here's 5 good ones right here. I do like that public ownership idea. That might come back around, or I have a few other videos that might mention that concept. But I don't know. Norfolk Southern is a pretty terrible railroad, and I'm not saying that Conrail was perfect, but I'm just saying that they never put a train on the ground because of a hot-boxed car.